Welcome to Public Health on Call, a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, where we bring evidence, experience, and perspective to make sense of today's leading health challenges. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes.
Hey listeners, it's Lindsay Smith-Rogers. Today, the recent announcement by the Health and Human Services Secretary that he will cancel $500 million in awards to researchers developing mRNA vaccines, the type of vaccines that allowed the rapid, life-saving development and deployment of COVID vaccines during the pandemic. Dr. Bill Moss, a Johns Hopkins vaccine expert, returns to the podcast to talk with Stephanie Desmon about what could be tragic consequences for public health and emergency preparedness. Let's listen.
Bill Moss, thanks so much for joining me on Public Health on Call.
Good to be with you again, Stephanie.
Bill, we have to talk about this elephant in the room. Last week, the Health Secretary, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., announced he was canceling nearly $500 million in grants and contracts for developing mRNA vaccines. So let's break this down. First, what is an mRNA vaccine and why is this important?
So first, in terms of tackling that question, let's talk a little bit about what our more standard vaccines are and then compare the mRNA vaccines to those. So first of all, I like to think of vaccines as trainers. They're trainers of our immune system, much like an athlete or a musician needs to train. What we're trying to do with vaccines is train our immune system to recognize and respond very quickly to a pathogen, whether that's a bacteria or a virus or even the protozoa that cause malaria. And so we're trying to train our immune system by exposing our immune system to some of the parts, all or parts of a particular pathogen, so that if we're actually infected with that pathogen, again, a virus or bacteria, our immune system can respond much more quickly and get a jump and defeat that pathogen and minimize our risk of disease. So we have a long history of vaccines. There are a number of different types of vaccines that we've used for decades, actually some going back 2 centuries when vaccines were first developed for smallpox. So first we have attenuated vaccines, which is basically takes the virus usually, or can be bacteria, but typically a virus like measles, mumps, or rubella viruses, and we weaken them. These are called attenuated vaccines. And then when those vaccine viruses are introduced into our body, they don't cause disease, but they can train our immune system. Another old type of vaccine are inactivated vaccines, where you take the bacteria or the virus and you basically kill it so that it can't replicate anymore. And that's introduced into our body to train our immune system. The inactivated polio vaccine or the rabies vaccine would be examples. More recently, in the past several decades, we can take what we call subunit vaccines, where you take a part of the pathogen. So rather than weakening it or killing it, we just take a part of it, the key part of it for our immune system, and use that to train our immune system. So hepatitis B vaccine or some of our vaccines against pneumococcus or Haemophilus influenza that can cause pneumonia or meningitis. And then another, again, a very old vaccine, are what we call toxoid vaccines for bacteria that produce toxins such as diphtheria or tetanus toxins. So we take that toxin, we make sure that we inactivate it. Basically, it's a protein, and inject that into the body to train our immune system. So all these are different ways of training our immune system. The mRNA vaccine uses a different strategy, and it's a very clever strategy. First of all, I'll say mRNA, we've known about mRNA since the early 1960s. There was work on mRNA vaccines for decades before the COVID vaccine. So this was not something new, but we just had an opportunity to develop and use it. And instead of part of a virus or a whole virus, basically it takes the genetic code, the RNA, that encodes for a particularly important protein, usually a protein on the surface of the virus, and then That is administered into our body. It's taken up by our cells, and our own body produces the protein. That's what's really uniquely different about mRNA vaccines than other vaccines. And so our body, so in the case of the COVID vaccines, the virus is SARS-CoV-2. The main protein we're interested in is called the spike protein on the surface of that virus. That's what our immune response sees and can eliminate the virus. So we insert the gene, the mRNA for the spike protein. Our body makes that spike protein for a limited amount of time. That's excreted from the cells, and it trains our immune system. It's just another way of training the immune system, but having the body actually produce the protein rather than introducing the protein itself. What makes this technology so exciting and so important, and why this pullback of the funding for mRNA vaccine development is so tragic, is that the mRNA vaccines can be developed in a very short period of time. For SARS-CoV-2, for COVID, we had the genetic sequence of that virus within a week or two of identifying the outbreak. And all you need is that genetic sequence, and you can make an mRNA vaccine. So the big advantages here of an mRNA vaccine is, one, it can be developed very quickly because of the technology. And two, it can be changed. So if we have a pathogen like SARS-CoV-2, like influenza, or a new pathogen like bird flu, we can change the vaccine very, very quickly to keep up with the evolving virus. And so that's what makes this vaccine technology so important for emerging pathogens and for pandemics, and particularly for pathogens that are just evolving very quickly.
Are these safe and effective?
These vaccines are safe and effective. So one of the reasons that RFK Jr. gave for withdrawing this funding is he made the false statement that these vaccines are not effective against respiratory viruses. They're very effective against respiratory viruses. We saw that during the COVID pandemic. The COVID mRNA vaccines prevented millions of deaths. What was tricky was that the virus was continuously evolving, and so it did take time to keep up. Influenza viruses change every year. That's what makes it so tricky for vaccine development. But they are very effective. It's important to talk about, when we talk about vaccine effectiveness, to think about what outcome we're talking about. These vaccines don't, and vaccines in general don't, prevent us from getting infection. What they're really designed for is to prevent disease, particularly severe disease, hospitalizations, and death. And these vaccines, the mRNA vaccines for COVID, do this very well. No vaccine and no drug is perfectly safe. There are adverse events associated with mRNA vaccines. Some of these are very rare. Many of them are very rare. And those very rare adverse events are very difficult, if not impossible, to detect in the clinical trials that are done, but turn up later. And we have very sensitive systems to identify suspected adverse events that may be related to a vaccine, and then that warrants further investigation and further studies. So, for example, myocarditis or inflammation of the heart can follow a vaccination with a COVID mRNA vaccine, particularly in young men. It's quite rare, maybe 20 or 30 cases per million doses, but there are real adverse events. But we know, for example, that the risk of myocarditis is maybe close to 10 times higher with natural COVID than following the vaccine. So there's still a risk-benefit ratio in favor of vaccination, even in higher risk populations.
Does this make us less prepared in the future? Because this feels like it's the creation of a national security threat.
You're exactly right, Stephanie. This does make us less safe going forward. We will not have the advances and the readiness to respond to another pandemic outbreak, another new pathogen, and it will happen. We know that we're going to see new emerging pathogens, maybe even new coronaviruses. And I just think it would be tremendously ironic if in the second Trump administration, we undermined what happened during the first Trump administration, and it was under Donald Trump that where Operation Warp Speed was funded, where these mRNA vaccines against COVID were very rapidly put into clinical trials, we were able to do clinical trials so quickly because there were so many cases. If there are only a few cases, it can take a long time to study the effectiveness of a vaccine. But when you have a lot of people getting infected, you can do these large clinical trials very quickly. It's just a matter of, how many cases there are so you can measure the outcome. It would be very ironic if one of the signature achievements of the first Trump administration during the COVID pandemic was the development of these vaccines, and that whole advancement gets undermined in a second Trump administration.
What's behind this?
There are a number of things. And, RFK Jr., the Secretary of Health and Human Services, has long been critical of mRNA vaccines. There's been a lot of conspiracy theories and misinformation about these vaccines. It's two things, I would say, two buckets. One is, as I alluded to earlier, the statement that these vaccines are not effective against respiratory pathogens, which is just patently false. Perhaps a more common belief is that these vaccines are harmful. And the Secretary of Health and Human Services at one point called these the deadliest vaccines ever developed, or referred to in that manner, which is just also patently untrue. Some people believe that these vaccines were developed too quickly. As I said before, there'd been at least 2 decades worth of work on these types of vaccines, and we were just poised to put them into practice with the COVID pandemic. And they, again, saved millions of lives. There's also a false belief that these vaccines can alter your DNA. That is also patently false. mRNA does not alter DNA. The messenger RNA is part of it. First of all, just so people understand what mRNA is, all of our cells are full of mRNA molecules. It's how we make proteins. The basic biology is going from the genetic code in DNA, in our chromosomes, to making messenger RNA, which are shorter sequences, and those are then translated into proteins. And this is how all cells make proteins. So there's nothing unnatural about mRNA. What these vaccines are doing are just giving basically a different menu or instruction to our cells to make a different type of protein, a protein that will then train our immune system. So there are a lot of misunderstandings and misconceptions around these, what an mRNA vaccine is or what mRNA is in general. I think, Stephanie, we saw, unfortunately, very tragically on Friday, a shooting at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention that was in part fueled by this disinformation around COVID vaccines, where apparently or allegedly the shooter believed that he had been harmed by these COVID vaccines, mRNA vaccines. And that comes from the rhetoric and disinformation that we're really hearing in some circles.
What type of mRNA vaccines were we expecting to arrive on the scene that these cuts will affect?
Yeah, so these cuts were, the $500 million was to cut 22 grants that were awarded by what's called BARDA, the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority. They largely work on tools and vaccines for emerging infections and pandemics. So that's where the biggest impact's going to be. Basically, our preparedness and our national security for the next emerging pathogen or pandemic. But mRNA vaccines have a huge potential beyond emerging pathogens. There's a lot of exciting early research around mRNA vaccines for other infectious diseases, like with HIV, where we haven't had success with the standard types of vaccines that we talked about earlier. There's also a lot of excitement about using these mRNA vaccines to treat cancer, pancreatic cancer, for example, or for autoimmune diseases like type 1 diabetes or multiple sclerosis. So there's huge potential for this technology, this mRNA technology and mRNA vaccines to treat not only, or prevent not only infectious diseases, but for treatment of some more chronic diseases and cancer as well. And where this undermining public confidence and federal funding for mRNA research is just going to really set us back, and other countries will move forward and we will be stalled.
Bill Moss, thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you very much, Stephanie, for having me.
Public Health on Call is a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, produced by Joshua Sharfstein, Lindsay Smith-Rogers, and Stephanie Desmon. Audio production by J.B. Arbogast, Michael Bonfils, Spencer Greer, Matthew Martin, and Philip Porter, with support from Chip Hickey. Distribution by Nick Moran. Production coordination by Catherine Ricardo. Analytics by Elisa Rosen. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes. Thank you for listening.